Let's do the big question in which we tackle a major news story of the day. Tonight, Transport Secretary Grant Shapps has called for an end to synchronised strikes with rail workers, postal workers, civil servants, doctors and others threatening winter strike action over pay. Is it time to introduce laws making going on strike more difficult? Or is being able to down tools to improve your pay and conditions a fundamental and inalienable right? To debate this, I'm delighted to welcome the Leader of the House of Commons, Conservative MP Mark Spencer, Emeritus Professor and British historian Keith Laybourne, and former Sunday Mirror newspaper editor Paul Connew. If I could start with you, Professor, you obviously have a lot of knowledge and experience about the history of industrial action in our country. Do you think we need tougher strike laws, given your knowledge of the past?
No, I think it's very simple. I mean, we've got the toughest strike laws we've had since the Second World War. In 2016, they were turned up. We've never had a situation where you had to give employers 2 weeks' notice. That was always a week. And in the 19th century, there was the distinction of it was a criminal offence if you went out as a worker, but as an employer, it was a civil offence if you didn't give them 7 days' notice. We've had a situation where the ballots, you've got to get 50% of the people voting, and then you've got to get a majority. And if you're in public areas, it's quite clearly more difficult, because if there were 100 people, you've got to get 50 or 40 of those have got to vote for a strike. So really, it's very difficult. And actually, if you think about it, we have very few strikes. We lose 800,000, 1 million man days a year. This is since the mid-1980s, since the miners' strike, when you would have 30, 40 million a year, or the winter of discontent of 78, 79, when you were getting 30, 40 million days strike, or the general strike in 1926, 164 million days lost in that year. We have actually had a very peaceful period for the last 30 years. I think the largest number of man days lost was in 2002. So I think it works very well. People have to have a right. If you're faced with a situation, I mean, one of the worst things really is the idea of if you get a mandate for a strike, it's got to be renewed within 6 months. If you do that, all it does is prolong disputes because they have to review them. They've just done them for the Criminal Bar Association. They've just voted again. In fact, actually, they're not striking, are they? They're just deciding not to take cases up. So I think it's wrong. I think you have to have that balance. Otherwise, what you've got, is in a sense no power for the working groups in the trade unions. And the trade union movement is very weak compared to what it used to be. In 1979, 13.5 million members, 6.5 million today. Really, in a sense, the position is relatively weak. I'm in a different position, but I'm in the UCU, the University and Colleges Union. Just think about the situation. Since 2008, their real wages have gone down 20%. 2009-10, they never got a wage increase. They're now being offered 3%. They're going to be facing forever 13%. You have to have the right to protest. Going back to the barristers, a quarter of them have left since 2017. And it's because the wages and the payments, I should say, have not gone up. So you have to have that balance. And in a democratic country, you have to have strikes. We have the strictest probably in Europe. So really, in a sense, I think by and large, you don't really get that many, conflicts of this size or impending size. 1979 was probably the last in the miners' strike of 1984-85. By and large, it works. But in fact, obviously, inflation at the rate it's going is a real problem behind driving a lot of these activities that are going on at that time, on the threatened strikes that are going on.
However, you do wonder, don't you, Mark Spencer, MP and Leader of the House of Commons, whether the likes of Mick Lynch, the RMT rail union leader, is agitating for trouble, very politically motivated. He's seeking unreasonable pay rises, which are inflation busting. We know we're running a deficit. We've got a colossal national debt. And many think he wants to bring down the government. Don't we need tougher laws to deal with troublemakers like Mick Lynch?
So I think it's true that there is a little bit of political motivation here, but I think the government does recognise that there is a huge challenge with the cost of living, and people do want to try and keep pace their wages with the size of their bills. That's why we've introduced a huge package of support for individuals. But I think we learned the lessons of the 1970s, that those huge mass walkouts, those big strike actions, only damage society. They don't actually work in the long term. And we have to recognise as a society that we've got to solve these challenges together. And, there are people in my constituency that are working in the private sector on fairly low wages, who are literally busting their backsides, working 50, 60 hours a week to try and make ends meet. And they can't just go on strike if they're working on the Tesco checkout, or they're an electrician or a plumber or a self-employed person like that. They've got to turn up to work every single day to pay the taxes to keep the system afloat.
Well, indeed, and I think that's going to be the view of many of my viewers and listeners. But Paul Connew, what's your opinion?
I couldn't agree with the professor more. Quite apart from the looming cost of living crisis, for the last 10 years, pay rises in this country have been below the rate of inflation. We now have inflation off the scale and heading that way, and tougher strike legislation is not going to change it. This is a government in trouble, who are desperately trying to recreate the late 70s, early 80s mentality, the same slogans, union barons, holding the country to ransom. But they are, I think, misreading the public mood music. The polls are showing a remarkable degree of sympathy, even among Tory voters, not Tory party members, which is a difference, but among Tory voters, especially in the temporarily lost, I suspect, red wall areas, where there is sympathy for the strikers. And I think your attack on Mick Lynch, I think Mick Lynch has become a bit of a folk hero. He is not an ultra-extremist. He's a tough negotiator. But we have a government who, and Grant Shapps, a man who won't go anywhere near the table. I mean, in the old days of beer and sandwiches, it sometimes worked. But this is a government who are trying to whip up, misreading the mood, as I said, trying to whip up the old cliches, and it's not working this time because the cost of living crisis is exploding in such a way that people, whether they're on the left or the right, are feeling the pinch, and the idea of declaring a sort of a class war or on the union movement is not going to work in the way that it did back in the heyday of Thatcher, if you call it a heyday.
Well, I think there are parallels, though, Paul Connew. I think there are parallels between what happened in the late 70s when the unions caused Britain to be the sick and lazy man of Europe. We're seeing it again with talk of synchronised strikes. The bottom line is that we're running a budget deficit. We've got over £2.1 trillion worth of national debt. Inflation, more or less 10% and rising. We can't afford these pay increases, which is exactly what the unions want. What happens if the rail workers, the postal workers, civil servants and doctors all get what they want? The country, Paul Connew, will be broke.
They're not going to get exactly what they want, but they will get, or will fight to get. I suspect they will get somewhere nearer, certainly much nearer the current offers on the table, because we have a new prime minister coming in whose economic policies, as spelled out during the campaign, do not make sense. Very few economists and a lot of Tory MPs I know don't believe her policies stack up either. What she has been, assuming she's going to win, which looks virtually certain, although I think the margin of victory will be somewhat smaller than the polls predict, but she is going to have to face up to reality. So far, Liz Truss has been talking to that tiny, unrepresentative audience of the Tory party membership who represent less than half of 1% of the UK electorate. It's an absolute nonsense that another prime minister is imposed on the country by such an unrepresentative, tiny minority of the overall electorate of 47 million. We can't even find out exactly what the Tory party membership is. There's an interesting legal move being started by the Tortoise website, headed by the former Times editor and BBC director of news, James Harding, to actually try to force the Tory party to reveal, A, what its membership figures really are, so we know precisely how many people are deciding our next Prime Minister, and also to find out what the percentage of Tory party membership are not British citizens either, who can vote for a Tory leader and a Prime Minister, but in many cases, are not in a position to vote in a general election. This is beyond satire.
All right, well, we'll have that conversation on another occasion. But, Professor, let me come back to you for your final thoughts on this. The bottom line is that the country is broke. These wage demands are unreasonable and the unions are irresponsible and must be actually put in their place and potentially through legislation.
Well, all that's nonsense. I mean, first of all, you said that Britain was
can we afford these pay rises?
In the 1970s. That's simply not true. It's not the trade unions that are ruining the country now. So let's get that into perspective. I think really, in a sense, if you go back to those the 70s and the 80s, the first thing that Margaret Thatcher did was to recognise that the level of inflation, and she set up a number of commissions that paid the army 20% more, the police 20% more, they paid the teachers 20% more to get it sort of sorted out and then to level out. So even she recognised that you had to do that. Really, in a sense, to start blaming the unions, which for the failure of British industry to invest and properly invest and actually properly pay their people is simply nonsense and wrong.
Well, look, the country is broke. That's my view. We'll have to agree to disagree on that one.
Who's breaking this country? Who's not paying the amount? It's all right you saying this. You're blaming everything on 6 million trade unionists. There's a Conservative Party that's been in power for, since 2010. We need something, a party that recognises. I mean, if you build up and store up injustice after injustice, inadequate pay increases after pay increases, what are you going to do? But remember, each person, I go back to the point, each person who's not a pensioner, and even I'm a pensioner, is also a consumer as well as a producer.
Keith Laybourne.
And I go back to the previous speaker there on that, and that is that to a large extent, there's a lot of support for people this time, in a way perhaps there wasn't in 1979.
Keith Laybourne. Yeah. Keith Laybourne, I've only got a couple of seconds left, and I want to come to Mark Spencer. But before you go, briefly, if you can, these wage demands, I mean, you don't accept that the country's broke. Well, we'll have to disagree on that one.
No,
if these wage demands are fulfilled, what will that do to inflation? And who's going to be paying for it? Why should the grandchildren of my viewers have to tackle the cost of extraordinary wage demands of these workers, given the fact that any bonuses, any boost in wages will come from borrowing? It's more borrowed money.
We're taxing them, but we're not, because they get tax exemptions for investing in the North Sea. Come on, let's have a society where you recognise that. I mean, let's come back to the other thing. We're going to have increased poverty, fuel poverty. We should be addressing those questions. People should be being paid proper living wages. And you're saying the trade unions are to blame for it. No, they're nothing to do with it. It's other factors, and you know that very well.
They're asking for pay rises that the country cannot afford. A student in GCSE economics could understand that one.
Striking a negotiating position.
Deeply grateful for your time. Well, look, let's bring Mark Spencer back in. Mark,
all these prices. I mean, come on. You're asking people to accept 3% when it's 10, 12, 13, 14. And you're asking people who can't afford to live at the present time to face even larger. I mean, are we a nation of citizens and citizenship,
Wait a minute.
The nurses were
this
offered 2 or 3%.
This is worse.
Releasing the controls.
Order.
We need a more
Professor.
equal society, and it's about time you start to stop knocking the unions and recognise that the unions aren't the problem. We lose 28 billion days a year in industrial injuries. We lose up to 200 million days in people not employed.
Okay,
You're complaining about 1 million days.
Professor,
there are other things that need to be addressed.
Professor, final question to you before I come to Mark Spencer. Were you against the 3 national lockdowns that saw us close the economy for 2.5 years?
Sorry, who are you talking to?
You.
Sorry,
Keith Laybourne.
which national economies?
Did you speak out against lockdowns? Did you speak out against the 3 national lockdowns which forced the Treasury to borrow £500 billion?
When?
Over the last 2.5 years. We just had a pandemic, in case you've forgotten.
No, what? In the pandemic?
Yes.
Oh, sorry,
did you object to lockdowns?
The pandemic. No, but I'll tell you what I was against. I was against the waste of money that went on. As we know, £12 billion on PPI equipment, which government pays £4 billion to people who can't even provide.
Okay, brilliant. Keith, thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Not the trade.
Thank you.
I came on here to talk about trade union history. Obviously, I'm not, but.
Okay.
You haven't really asked me that.
All right. Well, look, but Keith, I very much appreciate your input. Blimey, Mark Spencer, this is livelier than the House of Commons.
So you want to
yes.
Can I ask you for your thoughts?
The loud bullying voices of the trade unions, which I think we're witnessing tonight. The public sector pay rise that they're going to get is the largest in 20 years. But you've got to remember, it's normal, ordinary people that are picking up that tab, who are doing jobs which are less paid. The average railway worker owns £44,000 a year. This strike cannot be about low pay. It's not about job security, because the government's already committed that it will not do compulsory redundancies. So this is about trying to stick in the mud and not having the reforms to make the railways more efficient and more effective and a better value to the taxpayers who are out there working. And lots of my constituents would love to earn £44,000 a year. They're on nothing like that sort of salary, and they're having to pick up the tab in the private sector for these big wage increases, which the country cannot afford. And we've got to get some balance and fairness into the system and recognise if we all go for double-digit pay rises, then it simply will push up the spiral of inflation and we'll end up in the same place all over again.
Keith Laybourne, thank you so much for your time, Emeritus Professor and British historian, and also my thanks to former Sunday Mirror newspaper editor Paul Connew. Whilst I've got you on the line, Mark Spencer, just a quick reaction to the House of Commons being stormed by Extinction Rebellion today, with members of Extinction Rebellion supergluing themselves to the chamber.
Yeah, I think it's really disappointing, because every time you get an event like this, the reaction is to increase security, and you actually put another barrier between politicians and the general public. And we really have benefited from a fantastic open democracy in this country, access to politicians, access to your MP. And every time there is an issue of this nature, it increases the barriers of security between normal people and their members of parliament. And I think that is a great shame for our democracy.
Indeed. And 2 other quick ones, if I may. Very shortly, we'll be speaking to Paul Connew about his new book, all about Boris Johnson. And the question I'll be asking both Paul Connew and my panel is, will we miss Boris Johnson? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we'll miss him enormously, but he's going to hang around. He's not going to leave the House of Commons. He is a masterful communicator, is Boris. He has an ability to connect with people and to get his message across, the likes of which I don't think we'll see for a very long time. So we will miss him a great deal.
And is Liz Truss going to be a good Prime Minister? Mark Spencer?
Well, we'll find out. I hope so. We don't know whether she's won yet. We'll find out on Monday whether it's Liz or Rishi. But there's some big challenges ahead, and I shall be supporting whoever the winner is.
Mr. Spencer, we know how busy you are. Thank you so much for making the time to join us on Mark Dolan tonight. Leader of the House of Commons, Conservative MP Mark Spencer. Also, Emeritus Professor, British historian Academic and a brilliant public speaker, Keith Laybourne. Keith, thank you so much for joining us as well. Really enjoyed having you on the programme.